You may know that the theme for the parish for Advent is rejoice. This idea that during Advent we are called to rejoice. And if you look through the readings today, it's not too hard to catch a bit of a theme in all the readings. We should rejoice for what is to come. That certainly was true of days gone by. The prophet Isaiah, he said, God told him to prophesy, to say that there would be a time when God's salvation would come on the earth. And we go back and we read some of what Isaiah wrote, and we can easily see Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection in what he wrote. But there's lots of other things in those readings. Did you notice that in the responsorial, there was a story, it was reminding us of the story when Israel was exiled out of the land after the Babylonians had conquered them, and that they then returned to the land. And it said, although they will go forth weeping, carrying the seed to be sown, they shall come back rejoicing, carrying their sheaves. God promised them that they would indeed return to their land and that there would be rejoicing in that time. St. Paul, writing to the church at Philippi, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work in you will continue to complete it. The work that God starts in you and I. He promises us, if we're willing to keep going with him, keep walking with the Lord, he'll walk with us. As I was thinking about all this, though, I was wondering how it would sound to you. There was a chance that you might hear it as sort of, oh yeah, that's right up there with those passages from Isaiah where they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not wage war against one another, neither shall they learn war anymore. And you say, oh yeah. Oh, that pie in the sky stuff. Or perhaps you would think of this idea of like, oh yeah, rejoicing in what is to come. You might say, well, that was all in the past. What about now? That's why I wanted to do the little song and talk to the children about promises. Because another way to think about this would be to say, rejoice, because God keeps his promises. And that might bring it down to earth a little bit, bring it down into our lives a little bit. Look at all the promises that God makes to you and I, not to nations and history and world peace, but to you and I. As I mentioned to the children, God does promise us salvation, forgiveness. That might be useful to be reminded of, because this Wednesday, if you saw in the bulletin, we'll have our annual Advent penance service. And God will, if you choose to come, keep his promise. He will forgive all the stuff that you care to bring to confession. That's a wonderful thing. And this idea that God is with us at the Mass. I appreciate the fact I have sat through lots of church services over the years where I'm not sure I really felt God, but certainly all of us at some point have indeed encountered the Lord, if even in a small way, as we gather together. Especially for those of us like myself, I lived alone for so long in my life, and sometimes coming to church on Sunday was just this time to be around other people. Whether I knew them or not, whether anybody said anything to me or not, I could kind of rejoice in the fact that God was making his presence known to me through other people. And indeed, God keeps his promise because he teaches us how to live. We've often talked about God's wisdom. What does God tell us about how to conduct our lives? And God's promise is, if you'll do this stuff, things will be better. We don't always believe it, but has God ever broken his promise in that regard? But perhaps, too, even that isn't quite enough. Because it is possible that as we get into the middle of December, you yourself or you know someone, well, Christmas just isn't the time, the happy time, the joyous time, pardon me, that it is for everyone else. And that may just well be circumstances. Perhaps something pretty awful happened in your life on Christmas Day. Some years ago, I know a teenage boy, every year at Christmas time, he struggles thinking back to growing up as a single kid, pretty poor. He never got a lot of presents, and that somehow haunts him every year at Christmas. And so what of this to someone who struggles at Christmas, where the word rejoice seems to be, okay, that's for everybody else, that's not for me. Well, if I could just remind you of something that will be hard to hear. Often we tend to sort of mix too much our faith with our circumstances, especially circumstances as defined by our culture. So we think a good Christmas, a happy Christmas, has to be a particular sort of scenario. Decorations, lots of food at Christmas, people around, certainly lots of presents. That sort of image, if you will, that is painted for us, certainly by people who want to sell us things. But that is not God's vision of happiness. It's hard to hear, and it's probably even harder to actually pull off. But Jesus does very clearly tell us that happiness does not depend on our circumstances. It is not one of those things where, well, if I could only have a really good Christmas, then I'll be happy. Because some of you, myself included, we've tried that, and it worked. We had a really nice December 25th. But if you might go back and think about December 26th, you'll realize that that one wasn't quite as happy, because we had put all this effort into the wrong thing, if you will. Jesus tells us, now you can be happy, whether you're rich or poor, whether you are well connected to lots of other people, or whether you feel a little lonely, whether you're healthy, whether you're not. You can be happy. You can have this great life, this great connection to God and to others without all those trappings. How? Well, it's called being a disciple of Jesus, which, of course, it's easy to sign up for that job, a little harder to actually pull it off. But the Lord, I think, understands that we aren't going to be as good as we might be. He just wants us to try. He just wants to be with us on the journey. And that is where the real happiness lies. Because you could surround yourself with all sorts of things. You could, whether it's material or people, you could have a house full of folk come the 25th. And so many of us know that even in the midst of that, you can be incredibly lonely. You can be lonely if you've got thousands of people following your post on social media. The true connectedness, the true happiness starts with a connection with Jesus. And so as we continue through Advent, that's what I commend to you. You can rejoice because this possibility exists. And even if you and I haven't grasped it very well or much at all, or for some of us, maybe we're getting to the point where like, I think I'm finally starting to get this. That journey awaits us. And it is a great journey. And as you're on that journey, you don't even have to wait till you get there. Just even starting that journey is a cause for rejoicing.